Good afternoon and welcome back to another ironic introduction to another video. Don't mind the background, it's just some MCOC and chill video because I like to have something moving on the screen while I talk. Today, there's a lot I want to talk about, so I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. Some of it will be literally me reading off of notes I've taken because I want to keep my thoughts relatively in order. But I want to start off with like three major disclaimers or points. So the first one is that for a great deal of players, these issues won't be felt for a really long time, but for endgame players, there's a lot of issues that are being raised, very serious issues that affects the longevity of Marvel Contest of Champions. So while I urge any new or progressing players, people who are like yet to push Uncollected or people who are like recently Cavalier, this doesn't affect you yet. It will affect you in the future, but remain calm, enjoy the game. You might have 2 or 3 years, who knows, however long it takes you to clear the content before this even affects you. So just kind of keep patient in that regard. But I wanted to, point out that it is important to kind of keep an eye on it because this longevity and effect on the game could mean a lot of big changes or, maybe even potentially the end of MCOC as like a huge game in general. I hope it doesn't reach that point because eventually Kabam will listen, but I hope we, see action before it even comes to that kind of a potential peak. The second disclaimer is that I'm not angry or I'm not frustrated. I'm not raising any pitchforks or torches. I'm always kind of like this pseudo Kabam apologist, but there's a reason for it because like the anger is just displaced. So like this is still beta. Act 7 is still beta. It's not out yet. The whole point of beta is to point out these major problems, and I think that it's really, really important the player base stands up and points out huge flaws, but just getting angry doesn't solve anything. We need to have like clear solutions and alternatives for Kabam. Otherwise, like we can't just be like, hey, this is broken, don't do it. Next, like we have to provide an alternative solution. Otherwise, we can't actually expect Kabam to do anything because they can't differentiate between constructive and, hey, this is just a complaint that it's too hard. Kind of like the champion fight, right? Like there are so many people saying, oh, the fights are hard, the fights are hard, the fights are hard, that when an actual problem came up, it kind of got swept under the rug. And you could say, oh, that's Kabam's greed or whatever. I don't care. The point is that if we had a long series, a huge amount of community support, and then Kabam didn't listen, then we can get angry. But I feel like the conversation wasn't drafted there. And I wasn't part of the content creator program. I wasn't part of the beta, so that's different. But I reserve all of my anger or judgment or frustration until the content goes live. Like if I had done the champion fight in beta, I would have raised issues. And then if it went live and they didn't change anything, then I would have been pissed. Different conversation. Act 7's in beta. There's all these incredibly brutal fights and node interactions that I think need to be changed and adjusted, and I'm coming up with solutions and ways to keep them challenging. But until it goes live, I won't be like, oh, this is BS, this is Kabam greed, or blah, 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 or stupidity, any of that. Because none of that is true until it actually hits the game. So I think that disclaimer is really important. Sorry for kind of dragging it out. And then finally, I think it would be wrong for me not to acknowledge Seaton's announcement of taking a step back from his alliance. I think it's amazing that he's open and honest, and I really applaud that. And I think that I would really like to see Kabam kind of change things in the game because I hate to see that. I think like Seaton is such an amazing player. He's one of the huge reasons why I play this game. He's so entertaining and charismatic on screen. He does an amazing job of presenting so much information in the game. I would really, really hate to lose him. But I also think that dropping out of Alliance Quest and Alliance War or the burnout or the retirement is kind of inevitable, and actually it's expedited for whales, just kind of for where Kabam has set the rewards versus the difficulty. So I'll do a separate rant talking about updating both of those. I think Alliance Quest is relatively fair, so mostly just Alliance War, for how I feel like they could change or update Alliance War to make it have a longer lifespan and be more fun in general as an aspect of the game rather than just a grind that people do for resources. So those are my 3 disclaimers. So what I want to talk about is the fact that Marvel Contest of Champions is a gacha game. So it's got amazing fight mechanics, interaction, skills, and overall just like this amazing feeling of progression, but it's important to know that it's a gacha game. And when I say gacha game, like it's important that I Google that because what it means is they implement some kind of gacha, which it refers to like a capsule by vending machine mechanic or loot box to introduce players to spend in-game currency to receive a random virtual item. And the way that is in Marvel Marvel Contest of Champions is the champions, right? The crystals. That's the gacha system. And while it's this amazing fighting game, RPG, whatever you want to call it on the side, at the core, it's a gacha game. That's where they make their money. And that's something that's really, really important to know as I move into my further points. So, as a gacha game, it's fundamented and predicated on this feeling of progression, on the fact of getting better at the game, your roster grows stronger, you see prestige grow stronger, you push higher alliance quests, higher alliance war, you do longer and longer content, crazier and crazier things, and that feels amazing. The problem with progression is that you can only progress so much, right? There's always going to be a cap. Even in an online game, you can only push so far. Eventually, you have done everything the game has to offer. And there might be new content coming out, but eventually there's nothing coming out. There's nothing exciting. There's nothing new. And it becomes ever so increasingly challenging for developers to keep the game that way, fun and interactive, right? And we meme it and say fun and interactive when we're talking about not fun and interactive. But the thing is that in a gacha game, in a progression game-based setting, you have to understand it's ever more increasingly difficult. Sorry for the redundancy there. It's increasingly more difficult over time to keep the game fun and interactive. There are a lot of challenges, right? Because there are different multiple approaches. You could just do raw power scaling, right? World of Warcraft sees that, where essentially you just scale the numbers up every time. Scale the numbers up, scale the numbers up, scale the numbers up, nothing changes. That gets stale because eventually you're using the same skill set, the same champions to do the same thing. So you move into what I call, well, I guess it's more important to say you go base skill, right? Get good at the game. Then you go raw damage, tank / skill. So all that matters is that you either have the damage to clear the fights fast enough that you don't die, or you have the tank to survive through the fight long enough to kill the enemy before you die. And that's the base progression. So you go from base skill to raw damage / tank. And after that gets boring. That like works for a little while, right? When the roster of champions is small enough that you can have a clear tier list based on tankiness / raw damage output. But eventually, new champions come into the game and they don't add any extra value because eventually, right, like you just use the same champion to clear all your content. And we see that in like Act 4, where people say, oh, you can bring anyone to Act 4. That eventually becomes a problem. In a game like Marvel Contest of Champions, that's putting 2 champions in the game, they want you to want the new champion. And if there's no value in them besides damage and tankiness, game dies. So we move into this utility, right? Now champions have abilities, and those abilities are needed to push forward. We see more Act 5, maybe even Act 6.1, where you need like bleed immune, poison immune, right? Biohazard and stuff. Even like Havoc introduced to the game, you need an armor up or power drain, right? This utility, these broad scoping skills and abilities you need in order to clear a fight in one fight, right? Without having to use revives and stuff. And that's a really, really good place to be. That's kind of like the sweet spot for a gacha game because you have a broad amount of champions that you want. But at the same time, a lot of champions are incredibly viable, and you run into the risk of moving from utility into roster meta in any kind of gacha game. And the difference there is in utility, there's a lot of viable answers for one problem, and you can bring any of them. In roster meta, there is one problem and only one champion solution. And Marvel Contest of Champions has been shifting into a roster meta over time, and that's what's been causing this burnout. It's what made Act 6 so incredibly brutal. Like, no matter how you talk about the fights and how hard they are, etc., 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 what made them so incredibly frustrating was people felt like they could only do the fight with this champion. You could only clear Mr. Sinister if you have Heimdall Angelus energy. And yes, there are other answers, but like when people talk about that fight, that's the first thing you hear. You can only do X-Vic 6.2.6 champion boss if you have Captain America Infinity War or Symbiote Supreme. Not a good conversation to have. There are other solutions. I've seen people do it with Spider-Gwen. I've seen people do it with Morningstar. I've seen Doom and Stealth Suit Spidey. That's not the point. The point is the perception, right? And that roster meta is even more prevalent in Act 7. So there's a lot of problems there. And there are multiple fixes. And these are really, really important. So I'll talk about solutions to this kind of ever-expanding attempt to keep the game fun and interactive. Because I think that's really important. It's important to talk about the problem, recognize the difficulty for the developers, and then present the solution. So some solutions I see is fix the damage scaling. So there are a lot of champions in this game who would have value and could competitively be an option, right? Like people talk about can't stop, won't stop. You don't use Rhino for can't stop, won't stop. I think because one, it's a passive unstoppable and it doesn't work on the node. But even if it does, let's pretend it does. Rhino's damage is garbage. you're not going to go, like, you're just better off bringing a regular champion in and dealing with the reduced damage. That's how bad his damage is. But if you just scale all the damage from all the garbage tier champions up to be a competitive level, suddenly we're working with a large pool of champions instead of pulling like Daredevil and going, oh, well, you can use Daredevil against Invisible Woman, it's just going to be 1,000 hits. Okay, like, good talk, dude. But if Daredevil had the damage to actually like competitively be a response to Invisible Woman, he would compete with Nick Fury for that fight. You see what I'm saying? So that's like solution number one, is fix the damage scaling, and I think that's just a basic expectation of a gacha game like Marvel Contest of Champions. If you want your champions to be viable, they have to have a base amount of damage, and there's just so many champions that are missing that mark, and that's really, really easy to do. Just it's like raw stat increase across the board. I don't think there's anything wrong with that as we push later stages of content, and you can even make it a node, right? Like 2015 and 2016 champions get this damage boost, or only target specific champions the way they do in variants, and just do a large group like these 20 champions all have 100% attack increase. Just kind of level out the playing field. Especially since we're pushing more and more into you need this kind of ability set in order to counter this fight. So we're past the point of the damage meta, so it doesn't matter that all the champions do a viable amount of damage, because that's no longer the distinctive difference. The distinctive difference is their core ability. Two, I think that you need to have a clear and defined utility that isn't counterintuitively countered by node mechanics or unavoidable mechanics. So what I mean by that is it's awesome to have poison immunity and bleed immunity. I think those are great additions to the game. I think just at base, it's a passive thing that just makes it so simple to say, yup, you can't really use Cull Obsidian for this fight because there's 100% bleed, so you're just gonna die. But if you bring Colossus, you don't have to worry about bleed, and it's just a regular fight. Awesome. Immediate utility like that. But when you put something like Return to Sender 3 in the game, where it's, oh, you have to incinerate the opponent, but they shrug incinerates and they incinerate you instead. But if you shrug the incinerate or you're immune to the incinerate, you get a degen. So you have to incinerate. Two, you can't be incinerate immune, and even if you aren't incinerate immune, you're going to die to the incinerate anyways, which means you can't incinerate in the first place. You see how that's like counter-interactive? So, you know, it's fine. Have the defender need to be incinerated. Have them pass the incinerate back. Don't punish us for having an incinerate immune incinerate champion like Human Torch. Just kind of like a basic thing there. I think that's really, really simple. You know, if you're, especially something like Incinerate, where like there's not the world's largest amount of champions who incinerate in the game at all in the first place, so why punish us for reducing that incineration damage or preventing it? And that's just one of the nodes like in Act 7 that I really have a big problem with, is that counterintuitive utility, right? You've just nixed so many options as a result. Reward us for bringing the utility. Don't punish us for it. Don't make it so incredibly roster focused. So I think that number 2 is a really big deal. Just kind of take away that punishment. Number 3, if you're going to limit damage ever, any kind of reduced damage, any kind of, caustic temper, or the one where the one where like, do you bleed, or crit me if you can, all of those, if you're going to reduce damage, you also need to increase damage and reward us for bringing the right kind of damage. And at that point, then I don't mind so much about 90% reduced damage. The problem with 90% reduced damage is even if we bring the right kind of damage profile, it's an incredibly long fight. Like, absolutely ridiculously long. Which is, like, it's okay to make it longer, but, like, the one I'm talking about here is the Act 7 path that has Do You Bleed, but it also has, like, rotating invulnerabilities. It's just ridiculous. And they go, oh, well, we're giving you 200% increased bleed vulnerability. That's not enough to make up for the fact that we're losing all of our base damage, we have an incredibly limited roster pool, and they're rotating immunities. It needs to be at least 300% bleed damage if you're going to rotate immunities, or it can be 200% bleed damage, and then instead of rotating immunities, it can be rotating resistances, because the difference between resistances and immunities is with the resistances, our bleeds would stay. So all we have to do is keep stacking the bleeds, and then once the resistance drops, we'll get the damage again. And it's still going to be a long fight, but at least that's the only core mechanic, so we can do it with any kind of like consistent bleeders, like Nick Fury, Archangel, Gwenpool. These champions won't be incredibly punished because our bleeds are falling off. they'll just not deal damage in time windows. That's fine. Or extend the time windows to make it so it's like bleed, then poison, then incinerate, then cold snap, so that we have a much longer damage window. That's a solution as well. Or again, just scale the bleed vulnerability up. I think that's a solution as well. And this is the path I'm referring to, but I think all times when they do this, they need to provide a vulnerability. Like the Act 6.2 Mr. Sinister, I'm sorry if I forgot which path number it is, but the Mr. Sinister in Act 6 that has Caustic Temper, you need to reward us for having a poison immune champion with a Fury buff, you know? It should be like, while having an active Fury, do 100% increased damage, you know? Or have 50% reduced healing on the opponent. We need something to incentivize the value of that, because we're being punished to a limited roster, so we need all the champions within that limited roster to feel better. Like, the reason people don't actively recommend Kamala Khan is because it's so many revives to use Kamala Khan in that fight, despite the fact that she's a poison immune champion with a Fury. What if she had 100% increased damage while having a Fury on that fight? Suddenly you have like a relevant amount of damage on Kamala Khan and a viable answer. So I just think that's incredibly important for number 3. Anytime you reduce damage, you also need to enhance damage, and it needs to be substantial. That's super key. So number 4 is don't F your default opening on a boss fight. Now, what's a default opening? I'll talk about that in another video. Sorry, I've got a lot queued. A default opening is a standard parry combo. Parry stun combo into your opponent. And the reason you don't F with your default opening on a boss is everybody has to do that fight. And even in Act 7, that is the default way players play the game. So if you're going to fundamentally F the default opening, you're taking so much frustration on the player base, because it's automatically at this high skill tier level to clear, and like on top of that you're going to add node and interactions to limit the roster. Unbelievable. So I understand if you want to make it a high intercept fight, you want to make it a fight that makes it difficult to parry and stuff, totally reasonable. Or even if you are going to remove parry, then you need to give players a reasonable ability to use any champion, or have increased damage on intercept, or gain a Fury on intercept or something. Again, you need to reward that skill level. You can't just take away and not give something back, because when you do that, there's no sense of satisfaction. There's no, oh, I did this mechanic and I got something out of it. There's just frustration and anger from the player base. So I think that's incredibly important, especially on the default opening. Now, if you're punishing things like intercepts, you're punishing dexterity, you're punishing block damage, I think all of those are super reasonable. It's specifically the default opening because it's so core and fundamental to the game that Kabam has decided you need to have the parry mastery for free. That you can't mess with it without having some kind of countermeasures to accommodate. And then my fifth one is, if you're gonna give crazy fights like this in beta, you should give your beta testers fight suggestions. Because if you design a boss fight, you should have a relative idea of the challenges / the champion solutions you have for it. And if you don't have a list for it, then you probably overtuned the fight. You need to go back to the drawing board. But if you do have a list, and that list is say 5 to 10 champions, give it to your beta players. Tell your beta players, hey, these are the 3 boss fights this week. Instead of making you guess and figure it out, we're just telling you there might be other solutions, but these were the 5 champions we had in mind. This was the pool of utility. Like, we thought incinerate for this boss, or maybe you need to have the ability to evade for this boss, or anti-miss. Like, give them a straight up, these are the potential solutions we were thinking. Let us know what you think, because it takes away all the questions. We don't have to sit here and think, oh, is this interaction intended? Is this champion supposed to work this way on this fight? Because there's so many complications there. It just adds to the frustration. And instead, you would have beta players going, Kabam said use these 5 champions. I'm going to go test all 5 of those champions. And then we play, and we go, Kabam, I think that these other 3 champions would also work for this fight. Let me go check it. And then they try and they see. And then we could give feedback accordingly. And we're on the same page. But you give beta players 7 days? 7 days? Some of us work. Unbelievable. 7 days to clear an insane amount of content that's incredibly difficult, based on your level of skill, but for the average player, it's super challenging, and that's just not enough time, and you're not giving us a good start. You're not communicating with us your ideas or your intentions. Give us a rundown of what your plan was for your paths and your node interactions. Why did you put long shot on an incinerate path? where you need Incinerate immunity, but you're getting punished for being Incinerate immune? Why did you put Emma Frost with an insane amount of block damage on a boss node where, like the typical way to deal with Emma Frost is reparry, bait, heavy punish? You're just getting killed by the reparry. Heaven forbid you don't know how to reparry. So just kind of basic things I think that are incredibly important, and I hate to get animated about it, but I'm starting to feel that pressure. And then kind of a tip I think is incredibly important, that is, if you want to increase utility, right, kind of following these solutions and guides I have where you have clear defined utility and you're not counterintuitively counteracting that utility on a path. If you want to increase the value of utility of a specific pool, like let's say there's a large pool, say bleed immune, right? There's a lot of bleed immune champions, so you don't want to make it so, oh, I put a bleed node here and now they can bring 20 champions. Okay, well, maybe you just want to counter specifically Nick Fury. That's fine. Just put a fight in there that Nick Fury can't do. One, say, like, that has, if they shrug all passive bleeds or something like that, so that deep wounds doesn't stick. Or if the opponent were to go unblockable, like Red Guardian, stick him there so he can deal with Nick Fury. You can stick some problem fights in there that kind of broadens the range, but only stick just one problem fight, so they can still use their champion along the path, and they just have to bring another bleed immune champion to deal with that fight. And that's super reasonable. I think that's okay, and that's a really good way to get value out of the rest of the pool without forcing players to feel like they need specifically this champion, right? Don't put this champion can only be countered by 1 or X, like in a main story quest. Just put targeted counters for what you're trying to prevent, the cheese or the meme or the one champion's clear X path ideology. I understand, but you can just target it, and that's really reasonable to do. It's not that hard, especially with the large pool of champions in the game and nodes and stuff. Finally, I think one last really cool thing, I think this is just a miss. I don't expect this to have happened, but Book 2 Act 1, or what is now Act 7, but Book 2 Act 1 could have been an amazing opportunity to say no 5 stars. This was a total miss, in my opinion, to go out there and put out completely toned down content and then say no 5 stars, 4 stars and below only, and put out content the level of difficulty of Act 5 with nodes from Act 6 and stuff, and you would have breathed so much life into 4 stars in the game. You would have given whales and free-to-play players access to an amazing piece of content that would be fun-centric and not heavily fixated on this power scaling. And talking about longevity, you would have increased the longevity of the game, because what's causing so much problems right now is that 5-star and 6-star meta is being pushed. But if you breathe life into the 4 stars again, suddenly there's this new piece of content, this new pseudo expansion where 4 stars gain value. And that was just a huge miss, in my opinion. So next up, I want to talk about whale problems versus free-to-play concerns. So all of this comes down to additional issues. So for whales, it's just a common problem for any whale in any gacha game, is whales progress fast. They progress faster than free-to-play players, depending on how much money they spend, / how much money Kabam is willing to let them spend on the game. And that's just kind of an inevitable problem, is that a progression game requires a value and resource to be enjoyable. Otherwise, the rewards lack value. And if you let whales accelerate too fast, you're not going to be able to keep them entertained. It's not feasible. You cannot create content that entertains space whales and free-to-play players at the same time. It's not feasible. You will inevitably lose players on both sides as a result. So we see whales come, they play, they reach the end, they leave. That's a typical cycle. No matter what you do, that's inevitable. The important thing is recognizing how you keep that relatively in control, as well as how you minimize it on both sides as much as possible. And what that really comes down to is focusing and hyperfixating on the utility meta of broad pools of champions being valuable, allowing people to have kind of character selection, etc. And I think that's really, really important. And I think that for free-to-play players, on the flip side, as you push a higher and higher utility roster, a higher and higher roster-demanding roster, for free-to-play players, the problem for them is the opposite, is they're progressing too slow, right? They're getting so incredibly outpaced, they feel left behind, they feel demotivated, they feel like the game isn't catered to them and they can't even keep up, and why would they even bother? They lose all this interest, and then you lose a huge player portion there as well. Those are two huge problems, and it's completely polar problems that needs to be addressed. And I think there's a really easy solution for this. I think that if you focus on the aspects I've already mentioned, the solutions I've mentioned before, I think additionally in a game like Marvel Contest of Champions, you can focus on things like Marvel lore, right? So many people are like, I want to use Magneto because Magneto's this mutant badass. Or like if you're like me and you're like, I want to use Black Widow because she's my favorite Marvel Contest of Champions character. But we can't use them because we don't feel like they're viable answers. Make them viable answers. Make all the champions relatively viable answers with utility unique to them, and then group them based on your utility, create content based on the pools of utility you have, and now every champion feels good. And every once in a while, throw out content where you can literally bring every champion. I think Grandmaster is an amazing example of this, of a fight where it's like you can bring any champion, and that feels so good to be able to bring in your meme tier champions. And then really emphasize character personality, playstyles, and synergies to emphasize the value between the champions, right? Use synergies to take a champion who has like one or two utilities or select utilities and open them up to a pathway to another set of utilities. Group them by maybe more than one set of utilities. Like Caustic Temper is a great example of more than one utility. You need both a Fury and a Poison. And there's a lot of champions who fit that category but aren't viable because they don't deal enough damage. Raise the damage cap, see above solutions. And if you really emphasize playstyle, like heavy counter, like a lot of people really love parry counter. Some people really like baiting heavy, so they want high block proficiency, they don't want to take damage. Some people really like high regeneration, they like being, to run suicides or feel like they're not getting punished as hard. They can kind of catch up on a fight off of a single revive. Some people like alternative openings like Ghost or Quake, where they feel like they're getting around the base mechanics of the game in a fighting style. Use those to advertise your champions and differentiate it, right? You got 5 different Incinerate immunes, but all with 5 hugely different playstyles, like Colossus, who's a parry heavy champion, or Havoc, who is a special focus champion. Use that to your advantage to advertise the champion, but don't use it to limit the champions we can bring into content. There's a difference. And I think that's a really, really good way to bring life and excitement into the game, because we can feel like, oh, every champion is viable, every champion is good. And that would really, really, really help. And that's also going to help you longevity-wise if every champion is coming in with this base damage and base value, is because now we're always excited, oh, where can I use this champion? What content can I run? And I think that would be really, really good. So finally, I just want to talk about one last thing, and that's just addressing specifically the Sabretooth. Now, I'm going to compile all my thoughts on beta, as many as I can, and post them to the forums, if I can get into the forums, having some personal problems there. But I want to address specifically the Sabretooth, because I think that's one people are pointing out a lot. And I have some personal solutions I think would be really good. So if I can't get into the forums, if someone out there is listening and you're in the beta forums, you can post my ideas, take credit for them, I don't care. But just make sure you do it politely, because I want Kabam to properly listen. But I have some ideas to make that Sabretooth fight actually reasonable while maintaining the core mechanics of the fight. So I think if you make it so that mercy damage was reliant on the player having mercy and not Sabretooth, that would be amazing. Yes, you wouldn't be able to have a default opening, so you wouldn't really be able to parry, but once you got a stack of mercy, as long as you only intercepted and never well-timed block, you would be able to punish and kill the Sabretooth effectively. You'd be able to use any champion. It'd just be incredibly difficult, and eventually you'd only be able to intercept because you'd have to deal with Aspect of War. I think another solution is make it so that each mercy passive gives you block proficiency, passive block proficiency that circumvents Aspect of War. So yes, you would have an incredibly low block proficiency, but you would be able to stack up to 10 or 20 mercy passives by hitting into Sabretooth and then never parrying. And then when you had 20 or 30, you could have let's say a 1% block proficiency or 2% block proficiency. And then you'd be able to parry, circumvent the Aspect of War, so he wouldn't be unblockable. And then you'd have a 25 or 30 second damage window where you wouldn't be able to parry because you don't have any mercy stacks on yourself. And you'd kind of alternate between having to dex only and parry only and then go back into intercept only, and it'd be a really challenging fight, but you would actually have a reasonable damage window, and the Aspect of War gets to stay, but you don't get incredibly punished at the end where you can't even do the fight at all. I think that's a really good option. Effing remove Aspect of War. That's solution number 3. Sorry for the F-bomb, even if it's just implied. Why did you put that node there? Why did you put that node there without any clear and obvious solution? it's counterintuitive. Aspect of War on a node where you have to well-time block doesn't make sense. So you need to address the fact that you can't well-time block late into the fight. So essentially you can only revive at one point or bring very specific champion counters, Red Guardian. And that's not a viable solution for most players. So if you're going to do that, you need to provide alternative options for people to do damage without being incredibly punished, especially on a boss fight where like bringing Corvus Glaive and hitting into block isn't really a viable solution because we're talking about like 10,000 hits. And then finally, make it so the Mercy passive is permanent. If you stack, say, 3 or 5 or 10 or X amount, right? Insert number. So yes, eventually he'd still go unblockable, but if you could stack, you know, X Mercy passives before Aspect of War makes him go unblockable, you'd have an open damage window and you would only be able to intercept, sure, but at least you'd be able to damage him as long as you only intercept and you just have to worry about the unblockable Sabretooth at that point. Still a super challenging fight, but kind of like an inverted champion boss, right, where he's indestructible unless you dex 5 times. Sabretooth would be indestructible unless you dex 5 times and then parry, but it wouldn't be special specific. So that said, that's my rant. I'm kind of losing my voice at this point. Let me know what you think. Feel free to share or comment if you disagree. I'll do what I can to timestamp it, probably in the comments. But that said, I'll talk to y'all later. Peace.